Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I am Sue Breitkopf. I'm president of the Olmsted Network, and welcome to Conversations with Olmsted, which is our series that examines different aspects of Olmsted's influence on America's physical landscape and social fabric. Today, our topic is inclusive access in public spaces. Now, Olmsted the Olmsted firm in general designed parks that were meant to be social infrastructure that serve the widest possible public. And today the question is, what does inclusive access actually mean and where do we fall short? So our panelists today will explore accessible design that fosters inclusion in public spaces and how to balance preservation and inclusive design. So today we have our moderator, Dr. Austin Allen, principal at DesignJones and on faculty at University of Texas at Arlington. We have Kai Lawrence, environmental programs manager at Fort Greene Park Conservancy in Brooklyn, New York, and Alexa Vaughn, excuse me, inclusive landscape designer, on staff at Sasaki, as well as a student, if I'm not mistaken, at University of California at Los Angeles. Unfortunately, Finnegan Shannon could not join us today, and which is disappointing because their work is pretty incredible, especially in regards to this topic. It centers on disability culture and critiques the built environment. But I think we're going to drop a link to their website in the chat so that you all can check it out for yourselves. And with that, I turn it over to Austin Allen.
Hi, how's everybody today? And I am so happy to be here. I want to first say that I'm a member of the Olmsted Council, and I enjoy that role as both advocate and ambassador for the network, for the Olmsted Network, and what we can do in terms of educating and building next generations and organizations, institutions to keep the legacy of Olmsted going, to keep the legacy of the Olmsted firm alive. I am both in practice in terms of being one of the principals of DesignJones, landscape architecture firm, and I also teach and enjoy it as a professor of practice at University of Texas, Arlington. Both are enjoyable, both make me understand how wonderful it is to be in the field at this point and to really tackle and look at the challenges of inclusion and how this has changed over the centuries as public parks came to be. And we have a panel that I think is going to really bring that open and bring it up in terms of contemporary times. But one of the things I loved was that Olmsted saw parks, long before Central Park, but he saw one in particular that changed a lot for him, and that was that public park that happened in Liverpool, or across from Liverpool, in Birkenhead. And that was years before he really got started on that, but it did put that kernel in place that there's something about letting the public actually build from the ground up this experience called the public park. And for me, that has been that the public park, way before we got electricity and the internet, was the negotiated space. And that's not my original idea, but many people have pushed that point, that it is that negotiated space, that income, who you are in terms of being a citizen, non-citizen, whoever you are, access to the park is yours. And that is the beauty of that negotiation. Of course, over the time period, that has shifted in terms of what do we mean by the public and how do we enforce that, and what do we have to look for in terms of the future. I think we've got two people on today that are going to really help us with that. That's Kai and Alexa, and I really want to get started with them. I again wish that Finnegan was with us, but we'll keep Finnegan in spirit here and keep pushing the ideals forward. I want to start with Alexa today. And Alexa, if you would briefly introduce yourself and share one way your personal or professional experience has shaped how you think about access, belonging, or public landscapes.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rustin. That was a wonderful introduction. And so I'm Alexa speaking now, and I'm a late deafened and a predominantly speaking deaf person. And I also identify with the broader disabled community. And so really these identities that I have really shaped how I think about access, belonging, and public landscapes. And I really see lived experience as a valuable form of expertise in the design process. I believe we can't design inclusive landscapes without directly including disabled people in the process. And so this is the best way to really move beyond any personal assumptions we might have. And I'm also a scholar and a researcher. Similarly to you, Austin, I work on education as well. So I utilize critical disability studies as a type of lens to reframe narratives about the place of disabled people within the public sphere, within the landscape. And this does include Olmsted's work, particularly his institutional landscapes. And so I attempt to bridge a sort of gap between practice and scholarship in design and disability studies. And this is no easy task, but it's really shaped how I attempt to tackle problems of inaccessibility, exclusion, and also just erasure, disability, both in studying the history of the built environment, the history of landscape architecture, and in actually designing it, whether it's historic landscape that we are working to preserve or a newly designed landscape.
Thank you. And Kai, can we get similar from you? If you'd briefly introduce yourself and share one way your personal or professional experience has shaped how you think about access, belonging, or public landscapes?
Definitely. Well, I guess start off by saying hi, folks. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Kai Lawrence. I'm the Environmental Programs Manager at the Fort Greene Park Conservancy over here in Brooklyn. Our mission is to enrich and nurture Fort Greene Park as a public space. So emphasizing community, the right to belong, organize, and bond with nature. So my role as the environmental program manager directly correlates to that mission by creating these volunteer opportunities or these chances for engagement with the park and with nature, and also spearheading our youth programming around stewardship here at the park as well. So I guess to your second question, my thought process regarding access and belonging is always changing and adapting. You always have to make sure you're keeping up with modern times. But I would say a moment that really stands out for me personally was my previous struggles with knee pains and inflammation years ago. So that kind of caused me to see the world vastly different than I previously have. Walking additional miles to the nearest train station that has an elevator, or trying to order a cab or an Uber and realizing I can't bend my knees to even get in that Uber, so still inconvenience there. Or even finding different entrances within a park that are actually accommodating to me. So moments like that always keep me engaged in what those conversations around community, access, and inclusivity look like. So I'm glad to be in a role that allows me to be influential on that front.
I'm excited. I mean, both of you, are doing so much that moves this whole area of thought along. And Alexa, you want to talk more on some of your lived experiences that you've gone through, that challenges or what have you, in terms of both your professional practice, which I know has to be amazing just because of the scale of projects that happen, there at Sasaki. And, on the other hand, what would drive you then, okay, I'm going back and I'm gonna become, one of the people that really opens the frontier even more around this by, pursuing a PhD.
Definitely. So loaded question around the PhD. I think I'll tackle the Sasaki question first. I have been really privileged to be an accessibility specialist and a landscape designer at Sasaki, which, I'm practicing on the side while doing my doctoral studies. And for me, I need to find that balance between doing both because I feel like I'm very split in the middle between the scholar and the practitioner side of things with landscape architecture. But for the projects we worked on, to answer that question, I've been working on a lot of campuses since I joined Sasaki last year. And for me, it's been really rewarding because, campuses, university campuses are a really interesting type of space where you have a lot of people coming and going. It's, formative years for so many, emerging adults in society. And I think creating access on campuses is particularly important to me, not only as an academic, but somebody who, attended Berkeley, where the disability rights movement happened, and just trying to bring access and inclusion to as many university students and staff and faculty as possible. And in doing that work, I've been able to really focus on, creating accessible paths that are not only at a good slope for wheelchair users, but also providing, enough space to move more than one person at a time, which really seems kind of radical these days, just having enough space for multiple people to, exist on the same pathway at the same time and to move through. Thinking also about other design elements like having seating for resting. I know Finnegan works on a lot of these projects, creating really nice benches to sit. Good lighting, good shade, all of these things. And these are all elements of design that I bring in based off of my experience as a deaf person. So depth space, and specifically applications of depth space to the landscape, which I call depthscape. That really informs how I approach these projects, because I'm thinking beyond merely complying to, the ADA or any state codes that we're dealing with, and thinking more about that lived experience that has informed my personal needs and something that I found, overlap with different groups with different disabilities. And similarly to Kai, I've also had some chronic disabilities in the past, some, psychological disabilities as well. And I've found that a lot of these just intersectional experiences come through with many of us, and it's never really, we don't have this chance to just check a singular box, so to speak, right? It's really about coming to an understanding of how many different I guess customizable or flexible features we can think about, not just, providing one type of design element, but really thinking outside of the box. And then just very quickly, when it came to the PhD question, I feel like I could talk about the PhD for days, but I think for me, it came down to, I started with practice-based research, which really started with the depthscape work I was doing with my Landscape Architecture Foundation Fellowship when I started Design with Disabled People Now, which is a website of toolkits that I have. Again, very much informed by my own personal experience and finding gaps in practice where we don't have a lot of representation for disabled designers in our field just yet. It's still growing. So that informs sort of my desire to do slightly more formal research. And now I'm doing history, more so than practice-based research, looking at Olmsted's institutional landscapes, whether it be, Central Park and some of his asylum landscapes as well. And also Gallaudet University, which is the deaf university in Washington, D.C. And so all of these things kind of just converge for me in the sense that it has essentially been informed by my personal lived experiences with disabilities. It's sort of like fueled my fire in a sense, right? But really with the end goal of practicing, creating these landscapes, but also educating the next generation about that history and how it might impact the way that they approach their own work in the future. So
I can't say how valuable I think it is what you're talking about, and that's why it's a new frontier. I think that we're starting to really understand that everything from furnishing to this ideal that their deaf space that you're talking about, that we're not all thinking about these three dimensions in the same kind of way, and it just opens up. And I know we'll go into that in a little bit, but I don't want to leave Kai out of this conversation. All right. And the Kai's like, wait a minute, let's go. And Kai, I've been wanting to talk to you about this because a few weeks ago, the mayor picked a new commissioner, Tricia Shimamura, for parks. And she made a statement in there that I kind of liked, which was parks, meaning that department is the agency of affordability, which I said, okay, this is a different way of opening that door. And I know in your case, you have been really thinking about this delicate balance between historic preservation and making sure public landscapes are welcome to everyone. I'm gonna let you go at it for a while here. All right. And tell us what you think.
Definitely an amazing quote. Looking at Fort Greene Park, I think we're a great example of that push and pull you're kind of describing between what you said, preserving historic landscapes and making sure that the park works for everyone.
Yeah.
Oftentimes we see in history there are these spaces that are seen as the perfect get together, open for all, but in actuality, they're historically marginalized or certain communities that weren't prioritized in these types of decisions or these community spaces. So we always, as we move forward, have to think about how we are incorporating everyone, even a dedicated focus to the voices that have been kind of historically left out, right? And from an accessibility standpoint, one of the biggest opportunities for improvements that we are really anticipating right now is tied to the New York City Parks Capital Project Unit that is implementing a amazing ADA accessible fountain introducing, right? Light pole introducing project that can really revitalize the park and make it more inclusive to the communities that we see in modern times. I think where it gets tricky is Fort Greene Park's topography and its historic character, shape, everything from hills, grades, circulations, patterns, and small changes can always feel just huge to park users or the average Joe enjoying the park. So that is, I would say, one of those friction points that we see. But you can simply just look at the desire lines that exist, right? How are people using the park nowadays? Their feet will literally tell you when you trail it according to the lawns that they're walking on, right? Or the pathways that they're walking on. You can see modern day usage and what the community themselves value about the park. Where are they congregating? What do they consider to be the safe spaces of belonging and the easily accessible spaces, right? So I think one of the things that we like to keep at our forefront is always going to be community, thinking about how the community uses the space now, but also we don't want to limit ourselves to that way of thinking, right? Maybe you running into a community that's using the space a certain way because they're just missing this new big thing that would actually accommodate them. So finding that balance between how the community is using the space now, how we can enhance that, but also introducing those elements of improvement that add more access. So in regards to that capital project, well, we did not design that on the Conservancy end as a nonprofit, but we support the New York City Parks capital project team and the insight that they have there with designing, because they're planning on introducing a lot of ADA accessible ramps, right? And new walkways that can connect folks that have not been connected from certain playgrounds to certain lawns. I I do tours about this, so I think a lot of the times I can get caught up in a conversation about here are all the amazing things that we are going to do. Sit here and listen. But just to summarize, there's always that balance of when it comes to preservation and accommodating the modern day society, is just looking at how the community uses their spaces, right? What do we value about these spaces? And also the inverse of that. What are these spaces doing, communing, benefiting the community themselves, and how is it working in tandem with the people that exist with us? So I can go on a rant, but one thing I would say is we love the element of history within Fort Greene Park, and I always do my tours and speeches about the Army generals and some of the wars. I'm a big history guy, but we also do love the modern day volunteers that I work with and some of their concerns and making sure those are met as well. Yeah.
Very good. Because I think in both cases, I really want to get to that there is so much of this. The historical has so much of the spiritual built into it, the spirit of people who are around the place, what has been passed on for generations. And I think if you look at it, go back with that park in particular, Olmsted and Fox were picked because they wanted that kind of thing. This is one of those unusual moments that it is a public park that's brought in early, many parks years later, but your park was, they were at it in 1867 and they were late to the game, that's, and to be able to be the one that has to interpret all that. I only can imagine. But for both of you, do you find that people want to often just check the box in terms of accessibility, and yet somehow you have this real tension of the whole park? We want everybody to have access to the whole park, the whole range of experiences, and how do you reconcile that? I mean, because there's so many programmatic elements in a park of that size, or parks that I know you're looking at, Alexa, or campuses, even more so.
Should I take that, Kai, or do you want to go
Please.
first?
Oh, I mean, Alexa, if you want to, and I can piggyback off of you.
Definitely. Well, I think my general comment on that is just thinking outside of that box, right? Really comes with just thinking about providing options, flexible options and pathways to take, not just one accessible path, but multiple, different ways of getting through a site, different ways of enjoying it, different ways of, resting or activating certain parts of the site. And I think typically a lot of people are like, oh, well, I've checked the code requirement for this and I've achieved that, and then just kind of like, wipe their hands of it. But we have I think a lot of new designers coming into this space who are trying to think about, serving the greatest amount of people as possible. And it feels daunting sometimes to think outside of that box, because a lot of people I think are concerned about just not doing things the right way. And a lot of it has to do with relying more so on assumption, relying just on code, rather than, bringing our constituents into these projects and asking them, what they want, what they need, even what they desire for the space, not something that's required necessarily, but something that they would really experience joy with if we brought it into that space. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, very complex fabric. Some of these parks are massive, and it's just, you think about it, I guess if you think about it more systematically and you kind of zoom out and think about everything as, how can I make this more connective? How can I create more options? I think that's a big part of moving out of that checking the box mentality.
Yeah. Okay.
Add on as well, Alexa kind of hit on a lot of the points that I wanted to hit on, but to just sprinkle my 2 cents in, One thing that we do a lot at the Conservancy are community surveys, or even establishing share the park advisory groups where we go around and find members of the community that represent a type of usage within the park, right? Cyclists, right? Basketball players, tennis players, the folks that use the park, the dog owners. So I think when it comes to creating that space for seeing improvements, you have to make sure that you are reeling the community themselves in. And kind of to Alexa's point about checkboxes, there's still that balance, right? The professional landscapers that go through these years of training, they do have that experience. They have the book smarts. Not gonna knock them there, but a lot of the times you do have to be there in person viewing how the landscapes, the open spaces, and the parks are being used, and maybe even like update our codes, update our standards, update what our checkboxes actually look like so that we can be more accommodating to the community. And well, think it would even be beneficial for the system as a whole to have this new standard that's understandable.
Yeah. Um, I love what's being said because there's so much to this in that kind of way of updating, to really open the door more and be inclusive in that way. We did get a question from a Pamela from New York, and she asked, how can technology like QR codes, digital guides, et cetera, enhance accessibility for visitors with visual, hearing, or cognitive difference in urban parks? And
Ooh.
either one of you, please.
I might just jump in just from a creative standpoint. I love questions like these. We are always evolving what our promotional aspect looks like within the park, what our marketing looks like, how we communicate with the public. I think that is an amazing idea that many landscapes or many parks have kind of ventured a bit, learned from their mistakes, or some consider it even unventured, unventured area. But I think we have these signs that I'm thinking of in particular that sit next to our gardens, right? Where you can look at those and maybe read a bit of history about this garden. I think there's even space to have maybe more signage. Of course, we don't want these types of parks and these natural spaces to become these billboard ad type of areas. But I do think that there's space for landscapes, parks, open spaces to start to incorporate friendly messaging that shares that internal history, right? I do park tours where I'm sharing fun facts, where sometimes I realize, hey, we need to get this information on the website. I didn't actually realize this is something a bit more exclusive to us, and we need to make sure this is standard information for the public itself. I think QR codes, flyers, bulletin boards, even fun ways to utilize maybe chalk bulletin boards or structures, little log stumps that you can maybe carve directional signs or information on. You can get really creative with kind of guiding folks within parks and open spaces or just making them feel involved in the history that's going on. I definitely love that idea, and whoever that person was that dropped that in there, you're about to be a part of some big changes.
Pamela,
This is
look her up.
information.
She's in New York. But go ahead, Alexa, you want to add on that? Or?
Oh, yeah, I think you touched on a lot of great points, Kai. And I think really what this is about is just getting information out there, again, in a bunch of different formats, because really that increases access and inclusion. You never know what type of format someone might prefer. And, I think a lot of this also with, I guess, gathering what might be needed for these types of QR codes or history sharing, or whether it's, providing an accessibility map on a website that someone could refer to if they're trying to get through a site. We also do accessibility audits at Sasaki, which is something that I've actually been researching for several years now. But what we do is we bring disabled folks onto the site and do like a site walkthrough. And again, this is kind of beyond the code requirements that I was talking about, really just seeing like, what these stakeholders want or need in that space, whether it's a park or a campus. And that way you could also gather information, not just for the design, but, you know, if they want something like information in other formats, like with the QR code or the website that helps people guide themselves through the site, needs a little bit more assistance with helping to figure out, you know, how someone could navigate or wayfind or, you know, find a particular spot that is historically or culturally valid or something they're seeking for themselves to visit. That is one way to do it too. And it's really about just bringing in that sort of lived experience as a form of expertise and as a form of data, I guess, for our design process and for any type of information sharing.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear, you know, you talk about that in that kind of way. And I, wanted to throw out also that Mary from Virginia asked about funding. Okay, we've got these great ideals that are moving forward, you know, and just how, and I want to come to that in a minute, but when I first want to go back to something you said, Alexa, because it came in my head and I was like, wait a minute. The thing is, and I think this is for both of you, and then I'll come back to that, but for both of you, what happens in community engagement now that sets the tone for what's going to happen for a design of a space? How would you see the ideal situation? I know that it's been a delicate and difficult sometimes things when others have done those things, but if you have a community engagement session that you are going to set up right now, what are the particular things that you would put in place that you don't always see that would or hear that make the moment different today? And I say that because I think it's an area that for the discipline and for the field, we need a lot more sensitivity about engagement. So with that, please jump in.
Definitely. Thank you for that question, Austin. This is something that I've also been researching for several years with my toolkits on my website, Design with Disabled People Now. And I think that a major factor with just general stakeholder engagement meetings is they're usually not accessible at all. You'd be surprised if, you know, if I were to attend a random meeting in Los Angeles, for example, like maybe hosted by the city or whoever is hosting an engagement meeting, I often find that, you know, there's no captioning available or there are no sign language interpreters. And over time, some of these engagement meetings have provided an option to request, you know, a certain number of weeks in advance, which these things do take planning, of course, to book like an ASL interpreter, for example, or any kind of interpreter, whether it be Spanish, Chinese, anybody coming in. But I think one thing for me is that, you know, if these meetings just generally had captioning built in as a bare minimum, it's something that would make them more accessible to me from the start. Also, as designers, we are so visually minded, right? So we always have printed out plans, printed out renderings, subprints, diagrams, whatever we're sharing for a project process. And we very often forget that, you know, there are a lot of low vision and blind folks who want to participate in engagement. And if everything is just, you know, flat, just printed paper with no tactile elements, they're not able to participate very well, right? This is something Chris Downey has been doing a lot of work with as well. He's a brand architect. He's been investigating ways of making, you know, tactile plans. I also always recommend bringing in really just like 3D models of the site are really helpful for blind folks to kind of figure out what's going on. Could also do just bring in any type of materials you're considering for a project. There could be paving materials, for example, that are going to be, you know, someone could check and see if they are actually discernible by a white cane, which is a cane that a blind person would use to navigate a site. All these different things could come in. And Another thing also is if we have, neurodivergent folks coming in, if we have mothers with children, or just somebody who gets easily overwhelmed in social settings, having very quiet spaces to conduct these engagement meetings is important, having spaces to kind of maybe step out for a little while. And yeah, just general physical accessibility of these rooms with spaces where we host engagement is also important, being close to public transit, having accessible parking, like all of these different things. So many things come in, but I think once we start tackling some of these issues that we experience in engagement, even if it's just one or two things to start with, it makes a difference for a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders who would otherwise not participate in these very public engagements where they should be involved, right? So yeah, and I could talk about this for days. There are many other ways to go about doing this, but just a few things that come to mind.
Yeah, I even agree with you, Alexa. One thing I was going to add on as well is just that aspect of the recorded sessions, right? After these info sessions occur, these community meetings, having that recorded aspect of it that can be shared, right? Or emailed, or maybe you can have the recording into a QR code that's then plastered around the building of the facility, right? But everything that you talked about, it was resonating so much with me, just thinking about how can we, to what Austin was saying, introduce that wow factor that really engages everyone involved in these processes. So I love the idea of the physical 3D models. I love the idea of having the different auditorial systems that can still be of help and support for folks that may be like sonically impaired, right? But you can go on for hours about what these fun, creative methods or methodologies could look like. And I think to really hone in on Alexa's point, any first step is amazing, right? As long as you're transparent with the community about how you are planning on evolving, right? That transparency could be the wow factor in itself, right? Maybe there are folks that do still want to see a bit more from you in your visual presentations, right? Or your level of advocacy, or they want to see a more inclusive process in your open space planning, right? I think just having that first step, that first impactful thing, making sure that your project's budget includes the money to pay for folks who can come in and do these models as well. Thinking about that prep initial phase just as much as you are the actual execution of these types of projects as well. But I think Alexa already hit all the points, all the marks there.
Yeah, one of the things that always excites me in these is, and I think we've come to understand it, if you feed people, all right, if you feed people at these events, and I mean feed them, and not, here's some water, you really break the ice. You begin to get this moment where there's a whole other dialogue that you want and you desperately need, because that helps on the programming, that helps on the design. And I just get excited the more things I hear, from both of you and the things that are possible, because, I think that just we're not in a hurry at that moment. It's tell us what we can do with your home, your park, and that becomes really an important exchange. But I know Mary's important question, you were hinting to it, Kai. She says, she's from Virginia, and she says, funding is accessibility. Projects is always a challenge. What sources have you used in the past? Are there any that park practitioners should pursue?
I guess maybe I can jump in. Um, I think community engagement is very important, right? I think that's the foundation. Obviously, not saying that we're not involved in our communities or the person who responded saying that they're not involved, but I think when you engage the council members of that area, right? When you engage the other organizations or the other parks nearby and tap into those resources, you can maybe tap into an additional funding stream, right? Or build a partnership with them that allows them to put out a grant saying that this new project or this new idea will actually benefit 2 large-scale parks, right? Building that sense of community and working together to receive funding or put out a proposal for funding. I think nonprofits in general tend to lean towards a lot of grants, right? Discretionary funds, partnerships, or relations with corporate groups that may come in and want to volunteer. I think establishing that type of volunteer system is always helpful when you want to reel in the corporate groups that want to end up giving back to that park in your area. I think tapping into those council members and those lead officials with that funding and expressing your concerns is another way to put yourself at the forefront. Not saying that they're not already doing that, but there are so many ways to, even though it is very difficult, so many ways to go about receiving funding, right? Even if you want to just start from the nonprofit route, right? Having that donation page and maybe a couple of ideas around things that you would use those funds and do for the park, right? A photo of a colorful bench and you show the amount that would go towards that. That just looks visually amazing to folks and they feel like they want to contribute. So it can be in the form of the donation page, right? It can be in the form of just fundraising or reaching out to other parks and organizations to be a part of their events and maybe table as well. But definitely tapping into those like capital funds, your borough president, tapping into those council members, right? Reaching out to those corporations, as long as they align with your goals and your missions and you feel comfortable, tapping into those folks as well, because there are plenty of organizations, companies that are receiving these funding trickling down from the government, and they need to find that if spot. They need to find that wow spot. They're looking for that spot to give funding to so that they can say, hey, our funding is crucial to well, I'll use Fort Greene Park as an example. Our funding is crucial to Fort Greene Park. Look at what they've done with these funds. And when they say that back to their department, they may end up receiving an even larger stream of funds that they can then send over to your organization or your nonprofit. So definitely, I know I keep bringing up community, I keep bringing up talking to neighbors, but that is the key right now, and especially in terms of funding and finding those different avenues of revenue.
Yeah. Alexa, anything you want to add?
I think he nailed that. So thank you, Kai.
Not a problem.
Yeah. Okay. So Brandon from Pennsylvania asks, what design elements, whether that be trails or public space in parks, can be harnessed for an age-friendly landscape? We have an aging demographic in our community, and aging in place is important for our communities.
Yeah, I would say, everything that I've said previously does apply to aging as well when it comes to providing options. It's really about also providing spaces to rest, because a lot of elders like to, spend their time on a trail and have space to pause and to sit and to just take in the view maybe. I know that Finnegan has done a lot of work with designing benches just for this, that kind of call attention, not just for aging folks, but folks who might have mobility disabilities or chronic fatigue, anything that might come in with that experience, and really just critically bringing attention to, the need for spaces to sit and to rest. And I would say that's probably a big one. But yeah, a lot of it, whether it's aging, whether it's somebody who's younger with a disability, a lot of these experiences have overlap in terms of just having enough space to move, having enough space to rest and to pause. It's really, again, about providing options.
Yeah. You were mentioned Finnegan. I wanted him to talk about this project he did with a Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland, where they, it seemed like that kind of thing where you could still do a collective thing, but you were dealing with the mobility challenges that would happen at the same time. But we'll get him. We'll get them to talk at another point. We've got another question that Gene from Boston asked. What elements could designers employ to illustrate a vista for a person with vision impairment, or a soundscape for someone with impaired hearing? For example, I'm interested in going beyond Braille descriptions and typical ADA accessibility.
Do you want me to tackle that, or do you want to go first? Yeah, I mean, I would say like really the tactile model idea is really important. I've seen a lot of cultural sites that have tactile models of the entire site that would kind of illustrate, especially if the topography is really interesting, like if it's very high up, really clarifying, where a person is situated in that site. I know that you said you wanted to go beyond like maybe description, but honestly, visual description is everything to the blind community. I think in this sense, providing QR codes, as we were talking about before, is something on a website where someone could, listen through their headphones about like somebody describing what's in front of them. They would really be able to situate themselves in that space. For the deaf and hard of hearing community, with audio, we really just need captions and ASL interpretation. So a lot of, museum websites I've seen in Europe, for example, particularly in Italy, will have tours that are filmed in advance, and it will be, in Italian Sign Language or American Sign Language if we're here. And that helps someone navigate through the site and to come to an understanding of what's going on. And of course, if it's just sort of like a sonic experimental music type of a thing, that could be a little bit different, but it's also about having, I guess, description of what that would sound like. And there is an artist, a deaf artist named Christine Sun Kim, who she has done a lot of really interesting just art-based explorations of what captioning might look like, subtitles in a movie, for example, when you have like a lot of funky music going on or whatever type of music, not just putting like music notes that, like music is playing, but actually fully describing what that might sound like, the total vibe or the tones. So yeah, that's what I would say in terms of providing access.
Go ahead. Kai.
I would think, so I'm not in the kind of landscape specific or landscape design avenue. I teach youth about the park, the environment, and we implement an element of social justice. So I think one thing I'm always interested in when I'm coming across a lot of these different types of youth, right? Atypical, neurodivergent, right? So many different personalities and character types. One thing I'm always trying to figure out is how can I accommodate them and also have their ideas for designs that could help the park or improve our signage, what that can look like. And I think the hardest aspect of that is just understanding what methods are available, right? I think Alexa made some amazing points about certain types of audio technology that we can tap into. And I think that's actually the hardest part. And she was able to knock that all out in a quick speech. It's just understanding how creative can you get and where can you source that knowledge from? That is the hardest part always. Yeah.
Well, Alexa, with your work at Sasaki and Kai with your work at Fort Greene Park, one of the things that to me is so fascinating about public parks is the versatility of space. And if you could talk for a minute, I mean, Fort Greene Park has huge events. I mean, absolutely huge events. And yet in the same space can be very meditative, you know, and
Yeah.
I would love a lot more of the dialogue. How do you do this? Or how do you even imagine it, you know, when you're programming or thinking about spaces?
So one thing there, we are not going to take all of the credit. We like to see ourselves, the Forking Park Conservancy, as the community bulletin board. Like a lot of those events that you're seeing, we are putting those on, but we're also supporting other community partners and local stakeholders in executing that themselves. So I guess that's a quick misconception that I want to clear up. A lot of the times you're seeing maybe if you see our branding on it, we are heavily involved, but don't just think that that's just us. Like we are working alongside the entire community, the NYCHA communities, the nearby corporations and stores and vendors to make a lot of programming and film screenings happen. So not just us, like to see ourselves as that community billboard to get everyone's voices involved in the change or the new events that they'd like to see. Yeah.
Alexa, you want to add?
Yeah, I think really, parks are used by so many different people for so many different things, and I think that's what makes them unique. And I think Kai, you've illustrated a really great example with the Conservancy, just how, so many people make the space what they want of it, and it takes collective action to do that. And I think, with the disabled community in particular, when we're thinking about not just preserving historic spaces, but also accessing maybe new design that haven't thought about disabled people as much as maybe non-disabled people in the process, I don't think it's about erasing that friction, right? It's not about creating spaces that don't make disability visible. I think our bodies need to occupy space in a sense and, use it in the ways that we feel bring us the most joy. And I think one way of doing that with, the events that the Conservancy is hosting, for example, is just letting people be in the space in the way that they want to be there, in the way that they can be their fullest selves.
Well, I thank you all, and I think it's about that time, and I want to hand this back over to Sue and the Olmsted Network. We could keep going, maybe at some point part two, but right now I'd like to hand that back to Sue.
Well, thank you, Austin, Kai, and Alexa. That was a fantastic panel, and some really great takeaways. Like, I loved, Alexa, what you were talking about with going beyond ADA requirements. Like, there are things that are the law, and then there are things that are the right thing to do so that everybody has access. And community engagement. I mean, there's so many ways that community engagement is important, but we really have to talk to the community, be transparent with them. And Austin, what you said about providing them food, yes, definitely. So thank you all for this great panel and for participating. And thank you to everyone who joined us online. Just a couple of quick notes. We have our partner meeting coming up on February 19th. We have Lauren Meyer recapping the Olmsted firm in DC on March 19th. And we have a pop-up trip to Montreal, June 5th to 7th. So let us know if you need any more information on that. And thank you again. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.